In the red center of Australia, the outback is as unforgiving as it is breathtaking. A man, turning his back on the world, crosses paths with a young roo, its silhouette fading into the dust. From that moment, their journey together would echo what it truly means to belong to this land we call Australia. The day began the way most days begin in the red center, under a sky so clean and fierce it felt brand new. Alice Springs dozed in the heat like a cattle dog at noon, roofs shimmering, gum trees holding their breath, and the Todd River, a ribbon of pale memory under the verandas and radio masts. The air carried a fine red dust that settled on windshields and eyelashes, and the flies came on early, small black commas insisting on the sentence of every face. From the Stewart Highway came the distant hum of a road train shouldering its way south. From the west, over the McDonnell Ranges, the sun unrolled its white-hot carpet and told every living thing to pace itself. This country did not shout to be heard. It merely waited, and you learned to listen. On mornings like this, when the light sliced everything to its most honest shape, Ethan Cooper turned his back to town and walked out into the scrub. People in Alice Springs still nodded if they saw him, from the servo attendant with the sun-eaten cap to the postie who pedaled along with his bag like a saddle. But most learned not to call out. Ethan was a tall, wiry man in his early 50s, all sinew and economy, the kind who had been made practical by weather. The angles of his face read like a map that rain had forgotten. High cheekbones, a nose set straight as a star picket, a jaw that had learned patience. His close-cropped hair kept the red dust at bay, and a salt-gray stubble filed down his once careless smile into something quieter. He carried himself with the practiced care of a man who had watched things break and mend for a living. Once upon a time he had been the vet people rang when a station horse went lame at midnight, or a kelpie whelped too soon, or a feral camel wandered into the wrong fence line. He knew the inside of animals, arteries like creek lines, bones like fence rails, and he knew the sounds they made when pain met stubbornness and refused to move. Then life had torn a page out of him. That was what the town said, because the town was kind. In truth, it took the whole chapter. There had been a crash on a wet road 2 summers back, a curve that kept on curving, an ambulance with its lights lazy against the storm. Loss came with a soft blue blanket and a paper cup of water, and after, the world kept its shape, but the colors lost their certainty. Ethan did what country people do when language fails. He worked with his hands and let silence speak. He sold the little surgery on Larapinta Drive to a younger woman with bright eyes and a way of talking to anxious owners that won them over. And he moved into a weatherboard place with a tin roof that knew the sound of hail. He kept his tools oiled. He fixed what could be fixed. He went bush most mornings, his figure a long shadow on red sand, a hat brim pulled low, a canvas shirt bleached to the memory of green. He faced the ranges and not the town. Some afternoons, the wind pressed the scent of hot eucalyptus into his shirt as if the trees were trying to make him part of them. On this day, high blue, unmerciful, a wedge-tailed eagle dolloped on the thermal like a black thought. Ethan walked past Spinifex domes that glittered with sun, careful where he put his boots. The scrub moved in little ways, skinks zipping under leaves, a grasshopper with the confidence of a general, and far off, a mob of grays began to stipple the horizon with their patient feeding. He carried a small day pack with a roll of bandage, a cracked tin of saline, a thermos of Tegon tonic with smoke from a billy that had seen 50 campsites. He didn't call this a habit or a ritual. He did it because putting one foot in front of the other proved time still allowed him. The first sign of trouble was a mark in the sand that didn't suit the day. He knelt, the dust taking the offer of his knees, and studied the story there. 2 skids, a churn, a print that spoke of panic. A young roo, he thought, not yet hit his full weight, had tried to go where the country refused to make a path. He followed the scatter of prints into a patch of mulga and the flies followed him, officious as always. He found the animal half hidden beneath the angled shade of a fallen branch, the way fear tries to become geometry. A juvenile red, coat already holding that rusty blush, like the land had colored him from below, lay breathing shallow, its long tail curved like a question mark someone had left in a hurry. One hind leg held wrong, the delicate, hand-like forelimbs tremoring from stress, the ears swiveling to hold him and the horizon at the same time. In the glare, the roo's eyes were big brown wells, and in those wells, Ethan saw both the dumb animal fact of pain and the old country knowing that wears the face of calm. He crouched where the roo could see him side on, kept his own shadow out of the animal's space, and let his voice find that low register his patience had always trusted. "Steady, mate," he said, and the word mate did double duty, as it often does in this country, standing for stranger and friend, and not alone. He set the pack down slow, took off his hat, and offered the roo the shape of a man who would not rush. He saw a gash along the lower thigh, shallow, but long enough to matter. The leg might be sprained or simply frightened. He poured a trickle of saline over the cut, the liquid meeting red earth with a hiss like frying onions. The roo twitched, pulled in air with a small chuff, then went still, letting the cool do its work. Ethan tore a strip from a clean bandage and wrapped the wound, each turn of the cloth like an apology for whatever else the world had done. The whole time he talked not to fill silence, but to join it. "We'll get you right. We'll take it slow. The heat's not our friend today. You drink, I'll drink. We'll call it even." When the worst of the tremor had passed, Ethan brewed his tea with 3 good breaths of patience. The thermos lid served as a cup and smelled of smoke and tannin. He raised it to his lips, then set it nearer the roo, letting the scent ride the heat between them. They shared the same air for a while. The day held. Far off, a magpie gargled a song it had learned from water long gone, and a cloud like an old handkerchief attempted the courtesy of shade and failed. Ethan knew the practical future. He would have to get this animal up, coax it toward a track he could use, bring it home to the weatherboard house whose yard was a catalog of second chances. Wide old dog bowls that could hold water clear as a promise. A section of fence repaired one too many times. A shed with hooks for halters that had outlived their horses. He knew where the good towels were, which knife in the drawer still remembered how to be sharp. He also knew something less practical and more true, that he was not here to tame anything, least of all the part of himself that had learned to survive by looking away. When he finally rose, the light had shifted a fraction toward mercy. He stood with his back to town, as he always did, and the roo watched the man become the clean silhouette of motion. Ethan stepped and waited. The roo gathered himself and tried the shape of standing. The bandaged leg took a little weight, argued, accepted. The tail found the math again. The young red lifted his head, and the dust limned his outline as if the country were drawing him a second time. For a breath or two, they reached an understanding no one could audit. The man would not pretend he could fix everything. The animal would not pretend he could follow without fear, and both would take their lesson from the way this land turned survival into grace. "Rusty," Ethan said aloud, testing the color of the name in the heat. The roo's ears tipped toward him, small, deliberate, like someone turning a page. And then, as if to answer, the animal pivoted, showed the clean, strong plane of his back to the man, and made one small, stubborn bound into the light. Not a flight, not a farewell. A beginning written in the oldest handwriting there is, tracks laid one after the other, heading out. Ethan smiled, an expression that had not visited his face in its full length for too long, and followed. He walked behind the roo, reading the hop marks, reading the day, reading the part of himself that still believed in mending. At a break in the mulga, where the earth turned to a palette knife smear of clay and iron, the young red paused, looked back with one eye, then lifted again, that backlit silhouette fading and reappearing in the sash of heat, like an apparition that preferred honest company. When they reached the edge of a track a Hilux might trust, Ethan paused. The world had arranged itself into a scene he knew he would remember. The ranges stacked blue on blue, like sleeping animals, the white rib of road holding a line through the scrub, the breath of a land big enough to forgive mistakes if you learned their names. He sat, his hand lightly against the Roo's shoulder, the way a stockman sets a hand against a horse to say, "We go together for a spell," and he felt the quiver ease. "Good on you, Rusty," he said, and the words carried mateship without the vow, the promise without the chain. They moved then, the man a little behind, the Roo a little ahead, toward a future that neither had demanded, but both would meet. And as the sun tipped toward the hour when shadows grow honest and long, anyone watching from the high road would have seen exactly what the story wanted to be. A man, turned back from the world's noise, following the clean, fierce line of a young Roo's back through a country that takes and gives in equal measure, and in that shared direction, the first, undeniable beat of belonging. The days that followed Rusty's first uncertain hops brought Ethan into a rhythm he had not expected. He found himself leaving the town behind as usual, his back turned to the streets and voices, but this time there was a shadow waiting to meet him in the scrub. Rusty, still favoring the leg bound in bandage, would rise slowly from where he lay under the shade of a mulga tree, ears twitching at the flies, brown eyes patient as if measuring the morning. He was no longer just a creature to be helped. He was a presence, stubborn, wordless, and impossible to ignore. Ethan built a pen behind his weatherboard house, not one meant to trap, but to shelter. He carried water in an old trough, scattered hay bought from a neighbor, and each evening he sat on the veranda with a mug of tea, watching the young Roo stretch against the last of the light. From the road, those who passed saw Ethan as they always had, shoulders squared away from the world, a man who gave little of himself. But inside the yard, where no one looked, there was motion, care, and the awkward dance of two survivors learning the same tune. It was one such evening, the air still hot, even as stars began to appear, when Ethan heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A dust-covered Land Cruiser pulled up by his fence. The driver stepped out with the unhurried grace of someone who had grown into the land rather than against it. Maeve Johnson was in her mid-40s, tall and angular, her frame suggesting both endurance and elegance. Her skin bore the warm bronze of long days under the Outback sun, and her black hair, streaked here and there with early silver, was tied back loosely, curls escaping to brush her sharp cheekbones. Her eyes were dark, steady, and when they settled on Rusty, she smiled with recognition, not surprise. She wore a shirt faded by fieldwork, cargo trousers tucked into boots scuffed from rainforest trails, and around her neck hung a small, carved pendant of a kangaroo, worn smooth with years. Maeve introduced herself without ceremony. She was a field ecologist, part of a program documenting marsupial populations across Central Australia. But beneath the science was something older. Her grandmother had been an Arrernte woman who taught her the stories of the dreaming. Maeve spoke with a quiet authority, her voice soft, yet threaded with steel, the way one speaks when carrying both data and myth. She leaned on the fence, studying Rusty, who flicked his ears but did not flinch. "That Roo found you for a reason," she said. "They don't just wander into a man's life unless the land wants a thing done." Ethan, who had spent the better part of 2 years avoiding conversation, shifted uncomfortably. His first instinct was to turn away, present the world with the same view of his back he always did. But Maeve's gaze was steady, and he felt the old manners his mother had hammered into him rise unbidden. He offered her tea, which she accepted with a nod, and they sat on the veranda while the Roo dozed. She told him how kangaroos were not only animals to her people, they were guides, keepers of secrets, embodiments of strength hidden in humility. She explained the totemic bond, how each family line was tied to a creature or element, not as possession, but as kinship, with duties of respect and protection. Ethan listened without comment, eyes on the horizon where the ranges softened into dusk. He had spent his life dealing in muscle and blood, arteries and bone. To him, animals were puzzles to be fixed, beings to be kept breathing. Yet something in Maeve's words shifted the edges of his thoughts. He remembered the way Rusty had turned his back, not as retreat, but as if pointing forward to something unseen. It echoed the way Ethan himself turned his back to the world each day, not out of pride, but out of need. He felt the strangeness of recognition. Rusty's leg grew stronger. Each morning he bounded further, first across the yard, then out toward the dry creek bed, where wildflowers dared brief blooms after rare rains. Ethan followed at a distance, shoulders square, hat brim low. It became their silent ritual. Man and Roo, walking in tandem, always slightly apart, always with the sense that something unspoken was unfolding. One evening, as the heat finally broke into a cool breeze, Ethan found Rusty standing tall against the setting sun. The young Roo turned, ears alert, then made a clean bound toward the bush beyond the yard. He stopped once, only long enough for his silhouette to burn against the last light, then hopped on, vanishing into the mulga like a secret swallowed whole. Ethan stood there long after the dust had settled. Maeve, who had come by again with her notebooks and her calm voice, joined him. She did not speak at first, only watched the place where the Roo had disappeared. Finally, she said, "He'll be back. But you see now, don't you? He's not here to be kept. He's here to teach you how to walk forward, even when all you know is how to turn away." Ethan did not answer, but his silence carried more weight than words. For the first time in years, he felt not just the ache of loss, but the pull of possibility, as if the country itself had chosen this young Roo to remind him that backs are turned not only in grief, but also in guidance. That night, under a sky swollen with stars, Ethan dreamed of tracks in the sand stretching away from him, each print a mark of belonging, each bound a promise that even silence can carry a man forward. Word travels differently in a small town like Alice Springs. It does not move fast like gossip in the city. It seeps instead into the corners of pubs, across the counters of service stations, over the hum of air conditioners at the grocery. And soon enough, the word was this. A big red Roo had been seen limping near the mulga line, then bounding again, stronger, more defiant than most. Some swore it was taller than a man, its tail thick as a fence post, its stance like a prize fighter. For most, it was only a story to shake their heads at while sipping cold beer. For others, it was an opportunity. Connor Briggs was the sort of man who saw opportunity everywhere, though most of it came in the shape of something already alive. He was in his late 40s, broad-shouldered but softened by years of drinking, his belly pressing against the buttons of shirts once meant for stockmen. His face carried a permanent squint from a life lived in glare, the skin tough and sun-bitten, lines grooved around his mouth as if cut there by the outback wind. A wiry beard traced his jaw, more neglect than fashion, flecked with red dust that never washed out. His eyes were a washed-out blue, sharp when he wanted something, dull when he didn't. Connor had once worked honest, mustering cattle, running fences, but a fight at a rodeo that ended with a man in hospital had closed many doors. Since then, he kept company with men like himself, restless, angry at the world, and willing to trade in hides, meat, or anything that brought cash, no questions asked. He leaned at the bar of the Todd Tavern, a half-empty schooner sweating before him, listening as locals talked about the Roo that wouldn't quit. "Could fetch a good price, that one," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But the wrong ears heard, and the wrong grins answered. By the end of the week, he had gathered a crew of 3. Mick, a lanky fellow with a twitch in his jaw who had been caught poaching goats. Daryl, square-bodied with tattooed arms, who laughed at everything mean. And Kyle, the youngest, still thin as a rail and trying to prove he belonged. They weren't men built for patience, but Connor gave them direction. The Outback had always provided, and this time it would provide in muscle and hide. Back on his block, Ethan noticed changes in Rusty. The Roo had grown cautious, pausing longer before crossing open ground, ears flicking back even when no sound reached human ears. Some nights, he would stand near the fence line, back to Ethan, staring into the dark with that stillness that was not fear, but warning. Ethan read the signs the way bushmen do. Something was moving out there, something more deliberate than dingo or wild dog. He said nothing to Maeve when she came by, but she watched Rusty too, and her brow furrowed. She knew the pattern of hunters in a land that always drew them. The town's chatter thickened. Ethan felt it pressing against him at the supermarket, at the post office. Saw that big red again, near Simpson's Gap, someone would say, their eyes flicking sideways at him. He gave no answer, only the shape of his back walking away, his shirt worn pale by years of sun, his shoulders set against questions. People whispered that maybe the Roo was his. Maybe he was keeping it. Maybe he knew more than he said. He let them whisper. In a land like this, a man's silence was sometimes the loudest protection he could offer. But silence did not stop Connor Briggs. He began scouting, his battered ute prowling the dirt tracks west of town, headlights sweeping low scrub at night. He left cigarette butts crushed into the sand, and once Ethan found tire marks pressed over Roo tracks near his own fence line. Rusty grew restless, bounding further but always circling back, ears erect, tail twitching like a pendulum. The Roo's body spoke a language Ethan was learning to understand. There was danger here, and it was getting closer. One evening, as the sun bled itself flat across the ranges, Ethan stood with his hands hooked on his belt, looking out across the land. His back was to the town, as it always was, but this time he was not turning away from grief. He was bracing for what would come. The wind caught the hem of his faded shirt, flapping it against his frame, and for anyone watching from the high road, the picture was stark. A man weathered by years, standing against the horizon, with a Roo at his side, both facing outward. Behind them lay the murmurs of town. Before them stretched the silence of scrub and the promise of confrontation. Rusty shifted, ears pivoting toward a sound Ethan could not yet hear. The Roo's stance stiffened, back turned not in retreat, but in defiance, as if to say the land itself knew what shadow was coming. Ethan narrowed his eyes, feeling the grit of dust against his teeth. He had spent 2 years turning away from the world, but now the world was circling back. And whether he liked it or not, he would have to meet it. Morning came soft but clear, a rare coolness drifting across the desert before the heat grew teeth again. Ethan stood by the fence line, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes as he watched Rusty move. The Roo had grown taller, his chest broadening, his once awkward hops now carrying the clean rhythm of something meant for this land. His fur burned with a red tint that mirrored the sand itself, and when he bounded across the flats, the dust rose in a pale crown behind him. No longer the injured Joey in need of saving, Rusty had stepped into another role, one that Ethan could not ignore. One dawn, as mist lifted like breath from the Todd River's dry bed, Ethan saw Rusty standing still, ears pivoting, eyes alert. A shape appeared from the brush. Another kangaroo, smaller, gray-furred, cautious. Then another, a young doe with her Joey clinging awkwardly to her pouch. By the time the sun cleared the ranges, 6 Roos had gathered, forming a loose arc behind Rusty. Ethan leaned against the fence post, his arms folded. He saw the way Rusty held himself, shoulders square, tail pressed into the dust, chest lifted. The wild ones looked to him, not out of habit, but respect. Ethan whispered under his breath, "You're not just healed, mate. You're leading." Maeve Johnson arrived later that day, the Land Cruiser rattling down the gravel. She stepped out, her lean figure wrapped in the same field clothes, her hair pulled back, but untamed around the temples. Her dark eyes took in the sight of Rusty, flanked by his new companions. She smiled, a quiet lift at the corner of her mouth. "There it is," she said. "The back of the spirit. He turns, and others follow." Her pendant of carved kangaroo swung lightly against her chest as she leaned against the rail beside Ethan. "This is what I meant. Totems don't stay still. They show the way." Ethan shifted, the stubble along his jaw scratching as he tightened his mouth. "And me? Where's my way?" he asked, more to himself than her. Maeve turned her gaze on him, studying the tired lines of his face, the broad shoulders that carried silence like a load. "Maybe you've been turning your back on too much," she said. "Rusty doesn't look behind him because he isn't meant to. He looks forward. Perhaps it's time you did the same." Ethan let her words settle. He thought of the years of grief, of the empty rooms in his weatherboard house, of the tools hanging in the shed like relics of a life paused. He had hidden from the town, from questions, from memories. Watching Rusty step ahead with the mob at his heels, he realized he could not afford to keep facing only away. That week, the mobs grew. More kangaroos came, drawn by instinct, or by the silent authority Rusty carried. Ethan would see them silhouetted against the horizon at dusk, a loose circle around their leader, ears pointed, backs turned toward him, bodies aligned to Rusty's direction. It stirred something inside him that was not just pride, but recognition. He understood that leadership, even in animals, meant risk. It meant standing first in the path of danger. Connor Briggs and his hunters were still out there. The tire marks on tracks, the smell of cigarette smoke in the wind. These told him the shadow was not gone. One night, Ethan dreamed of his wife's face, framed by laughter he hadn't heard in years. In the dream, she stood with her back to him, walking toward the light over the ranges. He woke before dawn, the image sharp as the cold air. He walked outside, where Rusty stood with the mob, their silhouettes cut by the first amber stroke of sunrise. The Roo lifted his head, then hopped slowly forward, his back to Ethan, and the others followed. It was not abandonment. It was invitation. Ethan tightened his coat, shoulders stiffening, and for the first time in years, he felt not the weight of what he had lost, but the pull of what still lay ahead. When Maeve visited again, she found Ethan stacking tools into the tray of his old ute. He looked up, his face pale from the sun, but set with new resolve. "If they're coming for him," he said, "they'll have to get through me." Maeve placed her hand lightly on the tray, the lines in her fingers worn, but steady. "Then you're finally walking with him," she answered. She spoke softly, but the Outback seemed to carry her words further than sound. The following dawn delivered one of those rare skies, crisp, painted with streaks of pink and gold. Ethan stood on the rise, his shirt whipped by the wind. Rusty moved ahead, the mob falling in behind him in single file. Their backs caught the light, each shape a dark brushstroke on the canvas of the earth. For a moment, Ethan saw it clearly, the Roo's powerful silhouette leading others into the scrub, Maeve's words echoing in his mind, his own body turning not away from the world, but toward it. The land, harsh and merciless, had given him a second chance, and it was dressed in fur, the color of red dust. The heat had been building for days. Winds scoured across the red center, hot and restless, carrying the smell of tinder-dry spinifex and the faint tang of eucalyptus oil. By late afternoon, the sky had the strange amber cast that old-timers knew too well. Fires start small, in careless sparks, in broken bottles, in lightning that never bothers with rain. But once they begin, the country drinks them in and grows taller with flame. That evening, Ethan stood on his veranda, shirt stuck to his back, and watched the horizon pulse orange. A fire was moving through the scrub beyond the ridge, feeding on the dry grasses. Rusty stood near the fence with the mob behind him, his outline stark against the shifting light. He didn't panic. His ears twitched, his muscles coiled, His tail thumped the dirt as though it was reading the beat of something ancient. Ethan knew danger was coming closer. Not only the fire, but the men who had been circling for weeks. Connor Briggs chose his timing with a predator's sense. He and his crew rolled their utes toward the outskirts, headlights dimmed, rifles slung casually across shoulders. Connor wore his usual stained work shirt, buttons strained, his beard matted with sweat and ash. His pale eyes gleamed with hunger for the prize he had been chasing. Mick, lanky with his jaw twitching, carried a spotlight in one hand and a cigarette in the other. Daryl, thick-necked and tattooed, grinned as if the fire were a spectacle staged for him. Kyle, nervous and young, shifted from foot to foot, his thin frame quivering under the weight of a borrowed rifle. Maeve was there already. She had called the local community, and people answered. There was Jack Turner, an older Arunti man, his frame wiry and straight, despite his 70 years, skin dark and lined, his gray hair bound in a plait. He carried nothing more than a fire rake, and the kind of authority that came from knowing the land's moods longer than anyone else alive. Alongside him came younger faces, women with water tanks hitched to trailers, men hauling beaters to push down flames, children shepherded back to safety. The air buzzed with cicadas and with fear. Ethan stepped into the dust with them, a shovel in one hand, his eyes on Rusty. He hadn't spoken much since Maeve had named Rusty a spirit, but now his voice carried, "They'll come tonight. We don't let them through." His words were plain, but they were enough. The fire marched closer, its roar like the surf of an angry ocean. Sparks lifted and carried on the wind, landing in dry grass with greedy crackles. The smoke turned the air into a red fog that stung eyes and throats. Through that smoke, the hunters came, Connor at the front, shouting over the roar, "That roo's mine!" His voice cracked, raw with drink and greed, but it carried like a whip. The clash was not one of armies, but of will. Ethan, Maeve, and Jack stood their ground, the fire licking behind them. Flames painted their shadows, long and terrible across the sand. Rusty stood taller than he ever had, chest rising, ears back. He did not bolt. He turned his back, facing the fire, and with a sudden bound, he leapt into the smoke. The mob followed, does with joeys, young bucks, even the smaller grays, all streaming behind Rusty into the choking glow. Their silhouettes vanished and reappeared in the flickering light, a line of shadows with their leader at the front. Connor cursed, raising his rifle, but Kyle's hands shook too hard to aim, and Maeve's sharp cry, "Don't you dare!" cut through the chaos. Jack struck the ground with his rake, sparks leaping, his voice rolling in language older than any town, chanting to the fire and to the ancestors. The flames bent with the wind, turning back on themselves, swirling smoke into the faces of the hunters. Ethan felt the heat claw his skin, but he stood his ground, the shovel gripped like a staff. For the first time in years, he did not turn his back in retreat. He turned it, as Rusty had done, facing forward, showing the world he would not flinch. The hunters faltered, coughing, their headlights swallowed by smoke. Connor roared, but his men hesitated. Even Daryl's grin faded when he saw the shadows of kangaroos disappearing into the blaze. A vision, not of prey, but of something untouchable. The moment stretched like wire. Rusty's last bound into the red fog was clear in Ethan's eyes. The curve of his back, the powerful line of his legs, the tail carving balance in the air. It was slow motion in truth, a picture seared into memory. The back of the leader, carrying others into survival. Ethan felt something loosen inside his chest, something heavy lifted away with that leap. Then the fire roared louder, wind shifting, sparks scattering. The hunters stumbled back, cursing, eyes streaming. Maeve's people worked with quick hands, beating down flames, spraying water from the tanks, holding the line. Ethan joined them, his arms burning, smoke filling his lungs, but he kept swinging. Together they carved a safe path until the worst of the blaze passed, leaving behind only glowing embers and the echo of kangaroo feet swallowed into distance. When the smoke cleared enough to breathe, Ethan leaned on his shovel, sweat streaking the dust on his face. Maeve stood beside him, her pendant darkened with ash, her hair clinging to her cheek. Jack raised his rake like a staff, his eyes still bright with the fire's reflection. Connor's ute was gone, taillights swallowed by night, the hunters retreating with nothing but anger. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of settling coals. The mob was gone, safe in the dark beyond the flames. Rusty's back was the last they had seen, vanishing into smoke, leading his kind away from death. Ethan's chest heaved, but he felt steady, as if he had finally turned not away from the world, but into it. The fire left the land in silence. Blackened trees stood like ghosts, the sand dark with ash, and the air still carried the acrid tang of smoke, days after the last flame had died. Ethan walked the scarred ground each morning, his boots crunching against cinders, his eyes searching for what had survived. Life always returned out here, though never the same. Spinifex would sprout green against the black, magpies would return to their branches, and kangaroos would find new paths. But the land carried scars, just as the people did. Rusty came back on the third morning. Ethan saw him at first light, limping along the ridge with the mob behind him, his red fur dulled by soot, but his eyes steady. One leg bore a deep cut, the wound sealed but raw, and a scar already forming across the thigh. He moved slower than before, but still he moved ahead, tail sweeping balance across the ash. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The Roo turned his back toward the rising sun, and the mob fell in line. For Ethan, it was proof. Survival was not just chance. It was choice. Connor Briggs did not walk away so clean. The night of the fire, he and his crew had fled through smoke, coughing and blind. But law and land have long memories. In the weeks after, authorities followed tire tracks, locals offered names, and word spread of his poaching long before Rusty. Connor was arrested outside Tennant Creek, his battered ute loaded with traps and rifles. In court, he stood heavy and unshaven, his pale eyes dulled, his lawyer unable to argue against the evidence stacked like bricks. The town, long tired of whispers about his dealings, nodded in quiet approval when the sentence came down. Maeve was the one who spoke of what should come next. At a gathering outside Alice Springs, with the burnt horizon still a reminder behind them, she stood tall, her dark hair tied back, the carved kangaroo pendant bright against her shirt. She told the crowd that what had happened was more than a fire, more than a crime. It was a warning. "If we do not protect," she said, her voice steady, "we will only be left with stories and ash." Around her stood elders, rangers, station owners, even school children. A new campaign was born that day, a joint effort of locals and scientists to safeguard the mobs, to educate against poaching, to heal the land where the fire had torn through. Among the faces was Sarah Lewis, a young park ranger of about 30, fair-skinned with sunburnt freckles across her nose and cheeks, her sandy hair cut short under a wide-brimmed hat. Her eyes were green, sharp with resolve, and her manner brisk but kind. She had grown up on a cattle station before studying environmental science, and she carried both bush practicality and academic fire. Sarah took on the role of coordinating patrols, speaking with station families, and training younger rangers. Ethan watched her work with quiet admiration. She had the sort of forward energy he had once buried in himself. For Ethan, life shifted in small ways first. He opened his shed again, dusted off tools, sharpened knives, not to return to his old life, but to prepare for what might come. He helped Sarah and Maeve mark out safe zones for mobs, fixed water tanks on his block, and walked the burned ground with Jack Turner, who taught him how to read the new growth and predict where Roos would travel next. The silence that had once been his prison now became a form of listening, to land and to people alike. One evening, Maeve sat with him on the veranda. The air was cool, stars bright above the ranges. Rusty rested near the fence, the scar along his thigh a pale slash in the moonlight. Maeve looked at Ethan, her face softened by the night. "He carries the scar as a mark," she said. "Not weakness, but proof. You carry yours too." Ethan nodded, his jawline rough with stubble, his eyes gentler than they had been in years. "Maybe scars are how we know we kept going," he answered. Weeks passed into months. Rusty healed stronger, though the limp never left him. It became part of him, a reminder written into every bound. The mob trusted him still, following his back into valleys and out across plains. Ethan learned to see himself in that motion, not flawless, not free of pain, but forward. The day finally came when Ethan knew he could not stay in the weatherboard house with its empty rooms. He packed his few things into the ute, closed the door behind him, and turned his back on the loneliness he had once clung to. Maeve stood ready, her pendant glinting, her figure lean and strong against the rising dawn. Rusty waited near the ridge, his mob stretching behind him, like shadows stitched to the earth. The three of them, man, woman, and Rue, walked together into the new day. Their backs caught the sun as it rose, gold spilling across the land. From a distance, they were only silhouettes. A tall man with a hat brim low, a woman with dark hair lifting in the breeze, and a kangaroo with a scar that caught the light. They moved forward, not away. Toward the ranges, toward whatever stories waited, toward the kind of belonging that comes not from holding on, but from turning your back and walking into tomorrow. In the heart of the outback, where fire can take but life always returns, scars are not signs of weakness. They are proof that we kept going. For Australians, land and life are never separate. To care for a Roo, to stand with your mates, to walk forward even when the past holds you back. This is what it means to belong here. Just as Rusty carries his scar with pride, we too carry our stories, our families, our faith. And in this wide red land, we learn that turning your back is not always about leaving. It can be about leading. If this story touched your heart, share it with your mates. Leave us a comment about what it means to you, and subscribe so more people can walk with us through the land we love. May the Lord bless every one of you watching, keep you safe on your journey, and guide your steps, just as He guides ours beneath the Southern Cross.